Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Emily Rodriguez. I was recently senior fellow with the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. Welcome to this event, which is Careers in Neuroscience and Climate Change. This will give us an opportunity to speak with several people who are involved in the kind of intersection between climate change and neuroscience research as a part of their careers. I want to thank the Dana Foundation for supporting the Dana Foundation Career Network, as well as directing you to our website, neuroxcareers.org, where you can find the recording for this event, as well as other things about various interdisciplinary spaces with neuroscience. I'll put the URL in chat right now if you want to visit. Yeah, feel free to visit there if you're interested in further engaging with interdisciplinary work between neuroscience and society. I will now introduce our speakers, who will speak to their own work, and then we can open questions up for Q&A if you have anything that you'd like to ask about this area of research or how you get involved in that research yourself. Okay, cool. Let me start with our bios. I'll first introduce Dr. Janin Fuchs. Dr. Janin Fuchs received their BA in biology from the University of Chicago, completed their MS in psychology from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and achieved their PhD in neurosciences from the University of San Diego. They then went on to be a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Dallas, and an associate professor role at the University of North Texas in the Department of Biological Sciences, where they're now a professor. Dr. Fuchs's research encompasses developmental neuroscience and the role of primary cilia in birth and survival cells of the nervous system. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Kim Dole. Dr. Kim Dole is a cognitive and environmental psychologist and the head of the Environmental Collective Behavior Group at the University of Konstanz. The ECO group focuses on harnessing an interdisciplinary approach to address societal issues, particularly the challenges posed by climate change, through collective efforts and evidence-based solutions. They lead novel experimental research to understand the reciprocal relationships between a changing environment and humans and animals. Kimberly's own work integrates neuroscience, psychology, and climate science to examine how environmental change impacts the brain and behavior, and how to support sustainable collective action. She's a leader in the Big Team Science and the founding coordinator of the International Climate Psychology Collaboration, which brought together 258 researchers across 63 countries to test climate interventions globally. Kimberly also works closely with policymakers and stakeholders to translate scientific insights into real-world applications. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Burchini Keys. Dr. Burchini Keys is a neuroscientist with over 20 years of experience in research and consulting, focusing on brain disorders and mental health. Her work explores how climate change and environmental factors impact brain health and ways to transform these insights into tangible global health advancements. In 2023, Dr. Keys launched EcoNeuro, a research initiative dedicated to exploring the intersection of neuroscience and the environment. In 2024, she founded the International Neuroclimate Working Group, which she leads as a network of over 150 scientists, clinicians, policymakers, and public health experts. This group spearheads global research, advocacy, policy, and community efforts to address the effects of climate change on brain health. She earned her BSc in biomedical computation from Stanford University and her PhD in neurobiology from Columbia University. I'll next introduce Dr. Brian Knutson. Dr. Brian Knutson is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Stanford University. His research focuses on the neural basis of emotional experience and expression. He investigates the topic with a number of methods, including self-report, measurement of nonverbal behavior, comparative ethology, psychopharmacology, and neuroimaging. His long-term goal is to understand the neurochemical and neuroanatomical mechanisms responsible for emotional experience and to explore the implications of these feelings for the assessment and treatment of clinical disorders as well as for economic behavior. He received his BAs in experimental psychology and comparative religion from Trinity University, a PhD in experimental psychology from Stanford University, and has conducted postdoctoral research in effective neuroscience at UC San Francisco at the National Institutes of Health. He is a fellow for the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research and the Association for Psychological Science, and his research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and numerous private foundations. Finally, I'll introduce Dr. Nick Salway. Dr. Nick Sawa uses a combination of neuroimaging, behavioral experiments, and econometric surveys to understand why we make the environmental choices we do. His work is focused on how we value the environment, what motivates environmental philanthropy, and consumer decision making involving energy efficiency and eco-labeling. Currently, Dr. Sawa is a senior energy policy analyst at the think tank Energy Innovation, working with governments and NGOs internationally to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial sector. Dr. Salway holds a PhD in Environment and Resources and a BS in Biology from Stanford University. And during that time at Stanford was a senior fellow at the Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiative and fellow at the Stanford Center for Ethics and Society, the Haas Center for Public Service, and the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society. He also served for years as a lecturer in the EIPER Interdisciplinary Environmental Program on campus and returns to campus to teach on occasion. Great. Now that I've introduced everyone, I think we're going to proceed with our panelists discussing their own background and kind of how they got to the places in research they are, beginning with Dr. Fuchs.
Thank you, Emily, and others at the Dana Foundation Career Network for producing the NeuroX series of career options and for helping to get the word out that neuroscience has important contributions to make in confronting the climate crisis. Unlike the other speakers today, my research does not directly address climate, but even if you are only a neuroscientist, in your role as a citizen and an educator, you can find ways to bring up the topic of climate crisis. I do this, for example, if I'm giving talks on the value of undergraduate research, if I'm teaching courses or meeting a new university president, there are a lot of opportunities. The climate crisis is the most formidable challenge faced by humankind, yet our response is a ripple against a tidal wave. Confronting climate change will take a convergence of expertise, of course, from the STEM fields, but also political science, education, psychology, anthropology, sociology, law, ethics, economics, history, communication, and the media, just to name a few. Neuroscience is highly relevant. Cells in the nervous system transform stimuli into electrochemical codes. We experience the world as electrochemical patterns in a brain that was shaped by the need to survive in very different conditions. Ones that prevailed a few 100,000 years ago to a few thousand years ago. Climate affects the nervous system, which then further limits our ability to work against climate change. It affects brain health and well-being by bringing heat, pathogens, toxins, food scarcity, and destruction of habitat. It leads to anxiety, malaise, depression, social dysfunction, illness, pandemics. These effects escalate as people crowd into ever-shrinking habitats. Most neuroclimate research concerns the effects of climate on the nervous system, and the results foreshadow the future and intensify the urgency to act. Well, but how does the brain affect climate? Our distant ancestors may have planned for upcoming days and weeks, but not decades and centuries. The brain's reward systems are tuned to the here and now. Early humans could not survive as individuals. They lived in groups, and their genes were passed on by giving first priority to family and tribe, not by working for the good of a nation state or the planet. However, our species, for it to continue now, is not enough to protect one family or one nation. We are one planet. Our brain's evolutionary constraints get in the way of solving the problems that we created. We tiptoe around the elephant in the room. It is an inconvenient truth. In the recent national party conventions, was there even a whisper about it? Awareness of climate trends leaves us feeling helpless, sad, overwhelmed. Learned helplessness results from a perceived inability to have control over an outcome. And lack of control is a major factor leading to depression, which dampens our motivation to act. And there is the bystander effect. We tend not to help others in crisis if no one else is helping. There's a diffusion of responsibility. Climate changes already set in motion may have doomed our species and our ecosystem, but to give up and do nothing would be unspeakably unfair to our young people and the future of the planet. The sooner we act, the more likely it is that we can slow climate change enough that technological advances can slow it further. The expression man and animals makes as much sense as zebras and animals, as if we are superior enough to deserve our own phylogenetic tree. We are grossly overcrowding the earth and causing the extinction of other species, yet our very existence depends on an intricately balanced ecosystem. The ethologist Konrad Lorenz wrote in his book on aggression that humans, like other species, have an inborn drive to fight with each other over resources. That sparked outrage from some who took it to mean that war is inevitable. But Lorenz said that only when we can accept that aggression is part of our nature can we begin to manage it. Similarly, acknowledging the brain's limitations for dealing with the unprecedented climate crisis gives us a basis to work from. So, how can we work with what's known about brain and climate to mobilize action? Well, by nature, we are highly social creatures. We want to belong to groups with names and slogans, buttons and hats to solidify group identity. Doctors now prescribe social activities to improve the health of their patients. And increasingly, insurance companies cover these social prescriptions because they're cost effective. Social life is a major determinant for happiness, fulfillment, and health. And that gives you the idea that we can work in groups, maybe small groups, on projects like wildlife restoration that have immediate results, immediate positive reward. And at the same time, we're working for political action. You hear the claim that climate change is not proven. Students who graduate from high school without an understanding of the nature of research. A worthwhile hypothesis cannot be proven or disproven by data. Converging lines of evidence establish, for example, that evolution is a fact and that human activity impacts climate. Researchers are trained to evaluate evidence in order to distinguish fact from fiction. If we don't have that, we are tossed about in the deluge of alternative facts, false claims, and deceptions crafted by AI run amok. 42% of global population thinks about climate change rarely or not at all. At least 1 in 4 adults in the US think human activity, such as burning fossil fuels, does not contribute much, if anything, to global climate change. We need media to inform. This could be done through cartoons, documentaries, advertisements, drama, games, songs, stand up comedy, even weather forecasts, anything that entertains, informs, and can reach everyone. Climate should be portrayed as a unifying force, overriding political and personal preferences. It consumes us all. People want their governments to do more, and data show that the government probably has a bigger impact than expecting individual sacrifices. Groups can support candidates who represent the people and their ideas. Most of you watching this have a bachelor's degree and some research experience, which is a very rare combination and a very prized gift. You belong at the table where decisions are made. You can be leaders, you can be involved, and your ideas will be respected. Margaret Mead left us with her inspiring wisdom. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
That's great. I think if anyone has any questions specific to Dr. Fuchs' talk or anybody else on the panel, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as everyone's kind of spoken about their own interests and path. So feel free to do that. And next, Dr. Dole will speak. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
We can hear you.
Sorry, my headphones decided the exact moment that they would die. Makes sense. Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. And my name is Kim Dole. I am a group leader at the University of Wisconsin. So my group, the Environmental Collective Behavior Group. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the reciprocal relationship between climate change and the brain. And basically, I wanted to give a presentation mainly just to remember all of the things that I wanted to say to you, and also to kind of give an overview of how and why I think that neuroscience can be useful for helping to understand and even potentially fight climate change, using a few examples from my own research. All right, so I just to let you know who I am a cognitive neuroscientist. I actually did my PhD in borderline personality disorder, but then I switched over during my first postdoc and I went into environmental and social psychology. And then I also started dabbling a bit in behavioral science. So my career trajectory up until this point has been not traditional, I would say. I have gone through many different ways and many different pathways in order to get to where I am. But indeed, right now, my research mainly focuses is at the intersection of climate change, brain function, and collective action, and trying to better understand how both environmental stressors affect us neurologically, and also trying to understand how we can leverage insights about the brain to promote more sustainable behavior. Okay, so this reciprocal relationship that I mentioned before, this is from a paper that actually was written by myself, also in collaboration with Brian and Nick on the call. And basically what we wanted to do was outline how neuroscience could be used in the context of climate change. And we talk a lot about this reciprocal relationship. So basically trying to understand how humans impact our environment. So for example, we know that indeed we build our environments, we modify our environments to what we need. We also produce pollution. We also do many different things in order to bend our environments to what we need them to be in order to be able to have successful and fulfilling lives. In addition, we also know that the environment can have a very profound impact on us, right? If you think about your culture, your language, your favorite foods, things like this, all of these things about your environment have impacted you and essentially turned you into the person that you are. And there's quite a lot of scientific investigation that looks at this reciprocal relationship, but relatively less that actually looks at the changing climate. So how climate change and how is changing our environment, how that impacts us and how we impact the environment. And this is kind of a core theme within my research, looking at both of these different pathways and both of them together. So for example, in the first pathway, we tried to better understand different types of climate relevant behaviors. So one research question that we often test or try to understand is how can we actually promote more climate friendly behaviors? With the second pathway, we want to better understand how climate change is also impacting us. Does exposure to things like extreme heat actually impact the human brain and mind? This is a relatively newer line of research that we are taking as well. But like this, the idea is that we actually want to take insights from this pathway and also put it into this pathway. So for example, trying to better understand how climate change impacts us and turn that into intervention strategies that try to encourage people to engage in more pro-environmental behaviors, for example, or trying to help to reform policy. Just for the sake of time today, I'm going to focus mainly on the second pathway here because I think it's also might be more interesting, especially for the neuroscientists in the crowd. But so let's talk about climate change and how it affects the brain. So climate change is not just about rising sea levels or starving polar bears, right? We see extreme weather events are always increasing. So for example, hurricanes, we also see lots of floods, wildfires are becoming more prevalent and more severe, and also a lot of droughts. And each one of these can have a profound and direct impact on the human brain. So let's take forest fires, for example, and in particular, wildfire smoke, which I think would be an indirect cause or an indirect consequence of climate change. Well, inside of wildfire smoke, there are these fun little things called fine particulate matter. It's basically very, very small little pieces of smoke that are thrown up into the air as a result of the fire. This goes and then blankets things for miles and miles and miles. And as a result, humans, animals, and everything in between tends to breathe in this fine particulate matter. And they tend to be very, very small. And what can actually happen is that they're so small, they can actually infiltrate into our brains. And that is particularly problematic because indeed we are starting to see more evidence that exposure to fine particulate matter in particular has been linked to an increase in neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, Alzheimer's, so forth and so on. So this is just one very fun example about how the negative consequences of climate change can actually negatively impact our brains. And indeed, we're just starting to scratch the surface for understanding how climate change impacts brain health and brain functioning, and most importantly, for understanding how to offset some of these worst effects. So this brings me to the Heat and Cognition Project. So this is our latest initiative here at the Eco Group with my two postdocs, Selena and Mona. And basically what we're doing is we're working with nearly 500 collaborators so far across the globe. And our plan is to collect cognitive functioning data from 52 target cities, literally across the planet. Every inhabited continent we will be collecting data from. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to collect data during extreme heat. So for example, during a heat wave and also during a more temperate condition. And like this, we'll be able to compare and contrast and try to understand how exposure to this extreme heat impacts different facets of cognition. So for example, memory, attention, so forth and so on. We're also interested in understanding how this exposure relates to our social functioning. So does exposure to extreme heat reduce our social cohesion? Does it reduce our willingness to cooperate, our empathy, so forth and so on? And finally, trying to better understand whether or not exposure to extreme heat also reduces our psychological well-being. Does it increase our eco-anxiety, for example? These are just some of the questions that we are trying to ask and answer inside of this absolutely behemoth project. And most importantly, we're also trying to better understand the different indicators of adaptive capacity. So basically, our goal is to identify who is most vulnerable and why, and ultimately use this data to hopefully inform adaptation policies and heat health interventions. In addition, we also plan to use the insights from this project in order to conduct more neuroscientific studies in the future. So you might be asking yourself, why neuroscience? What does neuroscience have to do with climate change, and why should we be using neuroscience in this context? Well, I think it's really important to note that indeed, I do not believe that neuroscience will solve climate change in any way, shape, or form. But I think that neuroscientific methodologies and what we do in neuroscience can be really useful for helping us to understand the different processes that are happening to us and potentially help us to transform and to diagnose the problem. So for example, with diagnose, we want to be able to understand the impact of climate change on brain health. So for example, from our Heat and Cognition project, we can use insights from there in order to better understand how climate change is impacting us, and then put this into the scanner or bring in neuroscientific methodologies in order to better understand. So for example, let's say that we find that memory is something that is impacted. This is something that we can go and we can start looking into the brain and we can try to see whether or not, and if and how, what regions of the brain are being impacted. So if it is memory, for example, maybe we would look inside of the hippocampus, one of the regions that is most important for memory. And we can look in there and we can say, okay, is the hippocampus being impacted? If so, how? And try to get more at a mechanistic understanding. In addition, we can also then use this in order to intervene or test different types of interventions to see if it's actually possible to help offset some of these negative consequences. If the hippocampus is being impacted, which interventions are best to be able to help decrease those impacts? And finally, also for communication. In order to transform scientific findings into policy, we need clear, simple messages. So for example, not only do we see that poor working memory performance, but we have also demonstrated that exposure to extreme heat decreases the size of the hippocampus or the functionality or the connectivity. And this is one of the core regions for brain memory. So like this is something that is relatively easily digestible and something that we can take to policymakers and help them to package this message in a way that it's easily digestible, that we can then go and turn this into policies. And indeed, this is just one very simple example of how neuroscience can be leveraged in the context of climate change. So where do we go from here? Well, many people, including those on this call, are helping to develop a relatively new field called environmental neuroscience. It puts together insights, techniques, and methodologies from many, many, many different fields. And basically, environmental neuroscience helps us to better understand this reciprocal relationships between our environment, especially our changing environment, and human well-being, human brain, so forth and so on. And so like this, I think that it's a really interesting time because it's a really relatively new field, there's a really interesting time to be a neuroscientist because there are so many exciting opportunities, especially for early career researchers, so many new and interesting questions that can be asked and answered inside of this field. Thank you very much for all of your questions. And in case if anybody is interested in reading that article that was written with Brian and Nick, I put the QR code. You can follow it there. And there's also a short URL.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. Again, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat, and at the end, we'll address them all at once. But for now, let's move forward to Dr. Ikis. Sorry, I had to
No worries.
for a second.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Dana Foundation and the NeuroX team for having me here. And thank you for being here and being interested in this intersection of neuroscience and climate change. As Kim, I couldn't emphasize it more what Kim had said. This is such a exciting new field that we're creating at this intersection. And every week I receive emails from early career scientists such as yourselves and people who really from all over the world who want to do something. They're realizing how serious this climate crisis is, how it's affecting their lives, and they want to do something about it. And neuroscience is a great way to really make that difference. Jen, you did a great job of introducing the whole problem and why we have to have collective action. And I always love going after Kim because she is a true champion of this field and also a very eloquent speaker and really sets the tone for everything. And she's one of the founding members of our Neuroclimate Working Group that I'll be talking about today. So I can tell you a little bit about this journey of how, as a neuroscientist, I came to climate change field and what we're doing now with our group and how you can be involved, hopefully, if you're interested in this field. So I started my career as a neuroscience researcher, molecular cellular neurobiologist, looking at the mechanisms that are involved in neurodegenerative diseases, such as ALS and Alzheimer's disease. And I moved on to different, for the next decade or so, I did research in different areas, and also including rare neurological disorders and more serious mental illness. And about 3-4 years ago, and throughout those times, I always, whenever I thought, like many other neuroscientists I knew in the field, when I thought about the brain and brain health, what it means, we always looked inward. We always looked just at our brains, our neurons, our connections, our circuits, our synapses. And more and more, I realized that started realizing how important one of the questions that to me that was very interesting was why, let's say we had two siblings, very similar genetic makeup, why would one get a disease and one wouldn't? What's different in terms of the environment, the lifestyle? And these kind of questions started more residing in my mind. And then about 3-4 years ago, I got really interested in the climate crisis and wanted to be part of the climate action. And that was for personal reasons of having 3 young children and realizing our future is really going to be affected. And I wanted to, just like any other parent, wanted to leave my children a safer world and wanted to be part of the action. And I thought, okay, how can I most meaningfully contribute to this field? I study the brain. I know a little bit about the brain, as any neuroscientist would know. We can never know everything about the brain. So let me see what we know about how climate change impacts our brains. And when I initially looked, I couldn't really find, the PubMeds didn't show me any articles. Kim's article only came a couple of years after that. I couldn't find any scientists. So I started digging deeper and slowly started meeting people. Kim was one of the first people I have met in this field, and then started slowly finding people from different disciplines as well, epidemiologists interested in air pollution and children's brain development, psychologists interested in green spaces and mental well-being, clinicians, pediatricians interested in children's brain health, epilepsy, and the heat. And slowly, as I started talking to more people, they always kind of told me the same thing. Oh, you're the only other person I know who's interested in this area. And I said, no, no, actually, there's more of us. And that kind of made me think, okay, maybe we should come together and to solve this big puzzle, to be able to do something meaningful in this, let's come together. And both Jen and Kim talked about collective action. We actually, in our studies, find collective action as part of one of the big antidotes of climate anxiety too. So there is a really meaningful way of coming together. And with that, I had founded the Neuroclimate Working Group about a little more than a year ago. And when we started, we were about, and I'm gonna put a link to it for you guys to check it out right after too. When we started, we were about 30 or so scientists and some clinicians, a couple of policymakers in this space, and within 13 months now that we are here, we have about 180 members from 42 different countries. One of the primary things that was really interested for us was to be able to have representation and voices of lived experience, voices of research, resources, data coming from lower middle income countries as well, since these are the countries that are most affected, most vulnerable to climate change, yet there's very little resources and science coming from these spaces. So we want to really have representation, members from those countries that we can learn from, we can work together, collaborate. And now our group has, for example, the only psychiatrist in the country of Djibouti in our part of our group. The director of Latin American Brain Health Institute is part of our group. And what we try to do is kind of expand the knowledge space, expand research in this area, do global collaborations, multidisciplinary collaborations. So we don't not only have neuroscientists, but we have also economists. We also have architects and city planners that are interested in built environment and brain health and climate. We have policymakers, we have community workers. And one of the other goals of our group is something that Kim also had mentioned. How can we translate the scientific knowledge into tangible action to make the vulnerable communities stronger, our brains healthier, and for climate action itself, to be able to tackle climate crisis. And so the ways we try to do that is we do a lot of prepare reports and training materials. We have partnerships with Pan American Health Organization, World Health Organization. We're starting a new partnership with UNICEF. So at a very high level organizations see how can we put brain health into their focus areas when they think about the environment and the climate. One of the other things we do is we try to work with vulnerable communities from around the world, anywhere from Bangladesh to Japan to Chile, try to see how we can understand, learn from the indigenous communities there. This is a resilient brain project we're starting now to try to see what we can learn about the adaptation of these communities and find the mechanisms that are underlying. So bring epidemiology, anthropology, and neurobiology all together to be able to come up some answers into how to make our brains more resilient. And we also try to do a lot of advocacy and policy, thinking about policy recommendations, working at local levels with the cities, as well as more national levels, global levels, how we can impact policies as well. I invite any of you who are interested. One of the other things we try to do is capacity building. As Kim had mentioned, this is a really new field that is building. There's a lot of things we can do in this space, and there's a lot of attention coming from big organizations and fundraisers in this space as well. So I think it's going to be a great, exciting space for incoming new early career scientists, and we love to have them in our group as well, and to support them and involve them in different projects we're doing and in different publications we have. And yes, so please this is a wonderful place to be, and we're very excited you're interested in it, and we would love to welcome you, as well as all my amazing co-panelists here that I love to learn from. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Feel free to visit any of there have been a few links dropped in the chat if you want to explore more about people's work and this group specifically. Let's move forward. I know we're a little bit short on time, to Dr. Knudsen. Oh, if you're speaking, you're currently muted.
Thank you. I work on the brain. It's hard to talk about the brain without slides, so I'm going to use slides. This is going to be a little different. I've worked with Kim and with Nick on the call before on decision making, and Nick deserves the credit for dragging me into climate change. And obviously, this is the most pressing issue I think of our time because I think about emotion and decision making. I think that's part of what got us into the current situation. And so logically thinking about it, that should also help us to get out of the situation, I hope. Um, so what I'm going to describe is actually a collaboration with a company, Toyota, looking at changes in demand for vehicles with sustainable features like electric drivetrains. Um, and I guess the theme here is that we need all the solutions. We need to think about how climate affects the brain, as Kim mentioned, but we also need to think about um, how the brain affects climate. And perhaps this is even more pressing because if choice is determining our situation, then we need to change choice and we need all of the solutions for changing choice. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. Um, Actually, if you go back about 5 to 10 years, for most of the forecasts about demand for electric vehicles, they were way off. The demand around the world is escalating for these alternative fuel-sourced vehicles, both in the U.S. and in other countries, especially in China. Um, and there's not enough supply to meet the demand. And so this raises interesting questions about like what people tell you they want and what they actually want, which we call latent demand. Um, and can we use even neuroscience or other methods to try to get at this latent demand and then forecast it? And if that were the case, that could help a lot of people, not just consumers, but also companies. So I'm going to describe some work with the Toyota Research Institute, where we're not just trying to predict individual choice or preferences for electric vehicles, but we're also trying to forecast changes in demand for these vehicles using brain data as well as behavioral data. And the basic question is, can we use this neural activity to forecast changes in aggregate demand for these electric vehicles? So how are we going to do that? We're going to use a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and we're going to put people in there and we're going to have them make choices about cars. These are people who want to buy cars in the next 3 to 5 years. And then we're going to basically harvest their brain data and their behavioral data and then try to use that to forecast changes in demand for different models of vehicles. So this is very far out future-oriented stuff that we call neuroforecasting. It's basically trying to use brain data to go out of sample to forecast demand. And to be more specific about this, we've done basically 2 experiments where we scan people sort of in the spring. And we're trying to look at changes in demand for these vehicles over the course of the year when we're scanning people. So quarterly slope in demand, basically. So not just the average level of how many vehicles are sold in the United States, but like how is the demand for these vehicles increasing? And so we looked at 2 years. The first year was kind of a pilot study with small number of subjects, and the second year had more subjects. And I won't go into details on this task, but it's sort of a task that we've used to basically use brain activity to predict people's desire to buy different items, like the kinds of items you'd see on Amazon. The only difference is here we're actually showing them vehicles, and we're showing them minimal information about the vehicles, and we're asking them how much they would be interested in knowing more and purchasing these vehicles. And so, for instance, if you were in my magnet, you might see, a screen like this, and then you would see a screen with some evidence, some information about the drivetrain, electric or gas, and then you would answer these 2 simple questions: how much do you want to know more about the vehicle, and how much do you want to purchase the vehicle? And after the scan, we collect some individual difference measures too. So our target here, or the target for at least what I'm talking about, is we want actually to know not only the average demand for these vehicles, which is fairly predictable by the year before, but is there a change in demand? Is demand increasing for these particular models? And so I'm going to go straight to I'm blasting through this because I know I don't have very much time. But I'm going to go straight to the behavioral findings. And it turns out in our sample, we're scanning people in California. Um, People do have a slight preference for knowing more about and for purchasing the electric vehicles versus the gas vehicles. This may or may not be representative of the rest of the United States. But we can use their brain activity, these subjects, to predict whether they want to know more or purchase these vehicles. And basically, we see the usual suspects that we often see when people want to purchase items. That is increased activity in the nucleus accumbens, which is sort of a deep brain region that's implicated in motivation and wanting to approach things. And it's also modulated by dopamine. So you probably heard about this region in various other press venues. This also is not just about eating good food or approaching attractive mates, but it also plays a role in wanting to purchase various items on Amazon and apparently in wanting to purchase vehicles as well. This is the individual data, and I won't belabor this data. I won't go into these regression models, except to say that we can show that in models where we just use the neural data that we can actually predict it. If you're going to say yes, I want to purchase that vehicle based on just the activity in this region. What's more interesting for the purposes of what we're talking about today is what about other people? Does this tell us anything about how much people want to buy this car in the market in the United States? So this again is the x-axis here is now not one person's brain, but our sample's brain, the average brain activity in this nucleus accumbens region for each of these models. And the y-axis is how much did the demand for that model increase over 2022? And what you see is a positive association where the orange circles are models that use electricity, the blue circles are models that use gas, and you see a positive association between the general nucleus accumbens response to these vehicles and sort of how much demand for them has increased during that year. And you can also run these regression models to look at whether behavior has something to do with that. It does, but the brain activity is a better predictor of this aggregate slope and demand. So in fact, when you put them in the same model, the brain activity is really carrying the variance in terms of forecasting demand for these vehicles. And you can also look at features of the vehicles, are they electric or gas? And I won't go into this because it's kind of technical too, but you can sort of play these games of mediation where you're like, okay, I know that people in my sample seem to like these electric vehicles. Is that related to the change in demand for those vehicles over the year? And if you stick the brain activity in there, can you sort of account for that change in demand? And the answer, at least preliminarily, is yes, you can. So what this suggests is that the brain activity is telling us something additional beyond what people are telling us in terms of accounting for how attractive that car is going to be for that year. And we've also done this for another year, so different sample. Some of the cars have changed and so forth. And some of these cars have actually moved around on this plot. I won't go into which ones and why, but it's pretty interesting. But this sort of association between our sample's nucleus accumbens response and the increase in demand for those vehicles seems to be maintained. So this seems to at least work in 2 years where there's a lot of dynamism in the markets for these vehicles with new sustainable features. So not only can we use the brain activity to predict what individuals want, which is pretty cool, but we can use the average brain activity to forecast changes in demand for these vehicles with new features, some of which are sustainable. And this is of obvious interest to car companies, but it's also, I think, of interest to consumers. That they, just because they've never encountered a new feature or a new vehicle before, they may have some reaction to that can tell us something about what we want to provide the market, in terms of sustainable options that will be desirable to people. And so this could be a win-win-win, we think, for not just for consumers, but for companies and even for policymakers. So we've all talked about this. We're in this situation that has interconnected threats to humanity, but the climate crisis is perhaps the biggest one. If choice got us there, maybe choosing better can get us out of that. So thanks to you and thanks to our funders.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna allow Dr. Saway maximal time here. Again, if you have any questions, leave them in the chat. And if people want to stay after 10 to answer questions, if not, you can just email people directly if you'd like with questions. Thank you.
Great. And yeah, I'm happy to stay after if that is helpful. So I wanted to give kind of an overview. I know this is, you know, focused on careers that are bridging the gap between neuroscience and climate change. So walking through the different fields that I've worked in and how I've gotten there, and a little bit can touch on the kinds of research that Brian and I have done. He just walked through an example study, and so I'm not going to be getting too much into the weeds there, but giving some understanding of how and why that is useful and how it applies if you also want to go into more general fields in decision making or environmental work, policy work. So how did I get into this niche? Basically, I grew up with a brittle bone condition, had over 100 fractures. And so growing up, getting into nature was a big deal. I spent a lot of time indoors. So that was a sign of good health. And so that made nature really valued to me. And so ended up deciding to major in biology. And as much as I would have loved to do ecological field work, traipsing around Costa Rican jungle collecting samples wasn't exactly terribly pragmatic. So I pursued neuroscience, worked on primarily stroke prevention research, and worked in biotech for a while, but always wanted to work on nature and environmental issues. So one night I was randomly reading neuroeconomics papers for fun, as one does, and those studies were all about, how do we allocate scarce resources? How do we make trade-offs between short and long-term benefits, or between moral and economic values? And all of that's very relevant to the kind of dilemmas that we run into when we're trying to talk about climate change. And so when I started thinking about this was back in 2019. And I looked around to see if anybody had been working on that, and sorry, 2009 rather. And at that point, no one really was looking using neuroscience and the environment. So I saw if there was any path to exploring both. And Stanford has a program called the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources, and they're very forward-thinking. They allow people to combine, any fields creatively as long as they're studying environmental issues with enough importance. And so, started talking with Dr. Knudsen in the psych department to work on adapting neuroeconomic studies to look at environment, and did my PhD in that EIPA program, and then stayed on and has been a lecturer at Stanford since. So Kim touched on this earlier. What are the benefits? Why would you do neuroscience research? What's the benefits to looking at environmental questions? And some of the big aspects are, you can get a window into the mind, and you can reveal those emotional and cognitive mechanisms that are underlying the behavioral interventions that you'd want to do, the messaging that you'd want to do to help people make better decisions, make better choices, as Brian was alluding to. You can also take apart individual differences in decision making, like if people are more or less impulsive, or have stronger pro-environmental attitudes. And Brian touched on this a bit. We can even predict aggregate behavior, predict national behavior. So, over the last decade or so, been an increasing number of neuroimaging studies where they've been able to predict everything from music and movie sales to the efficacy of anti-smoking ad campaigns. And we've been showing this in environmental contexts as well, in terms of decisions around energy efficiency and forthcoming. We're also going to be talking about how people respond to nature imagery on social media, and maybe what that means for philanthropy. So really the promise here is, getting an understanding of mechanism, but also figuring out what the best way is to message people, to optimize interventions so that you can facilitate pro-environmental behaviors from people. And so these are just some of the topics that we've explored in Brian's lab, and also work I was doing in Lawrence Berkeley lab, and the intersections. We've got, if you want to Google either my name or Brian's name, a number of studies are going to crop up, and hopefully some more in the near future. And really, if you want to do work at these intersections, it's not just two fields that you're touching on with interdisciplinarity. You know, you've got neuroscience, psychology, economics, communication, education, political science, sociology, all very relevant, in addition to environmental sciences when you're trying to understand how people are making these complex decisions on, you know, something that is as overarching and also kind of hard to conceptualize as climate change. So, you know, broadly, some of the things that we've found in environmental neuroeconomics is, you know, emotion driving behavior, stronger pro-environmental attitudes really can amplify those emotional responses. We see that when people are donating their money to protect threatened park land. Sometimes the medial prefrontal cortex, when it's doing kind of more deliberative cost-benefit assessment, can predict, you know, keeping money for yourself, not donating, not putting money into energy efficiency choices. And we can distinguish not just in terms of environmental attitudes, but also between other types of thinkers. And in some cases, their environmental behavior is predicted by very different brain regions. So in the case of when we were studying the effect of eco-labeling on energy efficient purchases, we were able to distinguish people between having high or low financial discount rates. So high financial discount rate means you're more impulsive. And their behavior was predicted by nucleus accumbens, as Brian was alluding to earlier. So, you know, that positive emotional decision making. And then we saw the medial prefrontal cortex predicting the the decisions of people who were more deliberative and took a longer time view with their financial decisions. And really the promise of the neuroeconomics stuff, as I've said, is trying to figure out how do we impact, have the greatest impact, have the greatest sense of scale, right? And make the biggest difference. And so can we take, as a lot of these studies have shown, you know, 20 to 40 people's brains and extrapolate that and be able to use that brain activity to forecast what the general population is going to do, and use that to hone our messaging and make sure we're helping people make pro-environmental choices. So very briefly, my career trajectory, you know, started in neuroscience, in undergrad, technical and medical writer in biotech, did the PhD, lectured for a while, both in doing core courses for interdisciplinary research, and then some more psychology, decision-making focused courses, as well as environmental governance. And did a brief sojourn in tech. So one of the spin-off things, if you do neuroeconomics research, a lot of people have transitioned into tech because it lends itself very well to kind of a quantitative assessment of what people want, and market studies, kind of like Brian was showing with EVs there. And Netflix even has its own in-house climate group where they do studies trying to get climate messaging through in their content to more people. And then was currently I'm a senior energy policy analyst at a think tank, and really that's trying to help decarbonize the industrial sector. So much bigger shift on, you know, how do you address things at the policy level? How do you make sure emergent technologies are able to be implemented, you know, at scale? How do you incentivize people? So there's still a lot of elements of psychology there, but you're really looking at that. How do you market it properly given the incentives and needs of a given region, right? And so, neuroeconomics, very good at describing individual environmental behavior change, but that can be very slow, very context sensitive. Policy work can be, if it's done well, you can be impacting, millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions. But again, it's also subject to administrative change, and so we've seen how that makes things difficult lately. And so I'm going to just kind of open it up here if anybody wants to do questions, but we really have to adjust for scale. So right now in the think tank, we've really shifted from federal policy approaches, which have dried up, to focusing on things that are at different state levels and local levels. A lot of states are working to get themselves off of gas, California, Illinois, trying to figure out what that looks like for infrastructure. And then there's a lot of opportunity abroad in countries where climate change is less politicized. But interestingly, individual behavior change then becomes more important in those environments that we're in now, where political and technological solutions are a little harder to come by, and maybe working on that scale and reaching people and changing their minds becomes a major thing as well. And that's where neuroscience can help us out. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. This was great. We've run into an hour since start time, so I'm going to stop the recording. But if anybody is open to staying for answering questions, and you absolutely don't have to be, we can allow for a little bit of time after here. Let me stop the recording. Okay.